In this recording, I am looking at how the process I use to do my lesson planning. In today's specific lesson, I'm going to be looking at a new week's worth of lesson plans for the weather unit for 5th grade. It's our second unit of the year. We are already 2 weeks into the process, so having looked at this cap before, at the cap, one of the things that the starting documentation identified for me was that basically um, this unit breaks into about 5 different chunks, as the science department likes to call it. So the first chunk was about what is weather. The second chunk talked about what is the temperature and how does the sun warm the earth. And this week what we're going to be looking at is what is precipitation, what is humidity, and how are precipitation and humidity related. So that's the chunk that we're going to be kind of looking at this week as suggested by the science department. Um, so as I said, precipitation and humidity. We're going to be looking through in this section here. As you can see, we did already the what is weather for week 1. We did the temperature for week 2. So we will be starting out by looking at precipitation and humidity. We are going to be starting to look at the third part of what I do is to identify our days and how we're going to break these into days. So I have day 1. I am considering moving these into more of a weekly format rather than a daily format for science. Let's see, I'm going to move inside of the actual. Oh, the other thing I do is I like to mark. I'm going to go back here. I like to mark the current unit that we're on a different color, so you can see that weather here is orange rather than the rest that are blue. So inside of the weather unit, then going back to week 3, as we just said, identified earlier, I then go in through and create our days. This will be day 2. And I put in 4 days since we already have our Wednesday identified as our 5th day. And our at school day, I should say, and day 4. Moving through and continuing. Once I've got those days laid out, the next thing I start to do is going back to looking at the cap again, and what the cap starts to identify for me. I could start to think about, we've identified this as being related to precipitation and humidity and how that relates to weather. So I start to look at what resources the science department has offered us in relation to that already. You can see that there's not anything specific related to that from the science department. They do have a couple websites identified here that I can use. In relation to that, like the social studies department does a thing where they actually take and they do chunks together, and in each of those chunks they've identified, for example, in the social studies unit that I was just planning the other day, they had a chunk in there, or a cluster in there, related to the Incas. They had one in there for the Mayans. They had one in there for the Aztecs. And I was able to break each of those into a specific planning period for that social studies unit. Whether I'm using those chunks that that I showed you earlier as my breakdown. So the next question I ask myself is, I go up to the stage 1 and I ask, what are the essential questions related to precipitation and humidity? So for example, they have one here where they say students will be able to measure temperature, wind, humidity, and precipitation. So I like to take that and put that in to my plan for week 3. And what I do is I actually create a separate folder in here called the CCAP objectives. And from inside of that, I start to identify actual page where I list off my objectives. So in here, I'm going to share the one that I copied and pasted. And this is my objectives. And I will add to this. So going back to the cap again, here, continuing to look at what are the objectives focusing specifically on precipitation and humidity. So I'm just kind of scanning through and looking through each of these here. Well, we have the water cycle that does talk about precipitation, evaporation, condensation, and accumulation. So I'm going to also add that in. So that's another part of what I will be putting in the week 3 objectives. Oops, clean that up a little bit. There we go. All right, so that's another thing that I'll add in. And I continue this process basically adding to the objectives, and you'll see a continuation of this later. So that's my CCAP objectives. That helps guide my thinking of what I'm going to put in these 4 days down here. In addition, the other thing I love about having the objectives is I can specifically say, going back to these objectives here, that I can create discussion boards based on those objectives. So I could say, for example, the water cycle here, I could simply go into the acuity here, into the Schoology here, and I could go back to, for example, day 2, because I usually like it to be not on day 1 or day 2, sometimes later in the week where I start to ask questions so that the students have an opportunity to gather information. So also, for example, say in here I might have a discussion, and granted I will have discussions every day, but these ones specifically coming from the CCAP I like to have later in the week. I might say, what are the four parts of the water cycle? How are they related? So I basically dig that off from specifically from looking strictly at the CCAP. I do like to enlarge all of these a little bit larger. Let's see, and I give it a title. And I usually give discussions of this simplified measure a 10-point value, and then create it. So as you can see, I'm pulling some of these discussions strictly right from the CCAP and the objectives identified by the Science and Social Studies and Math department. I can continue that process, that same idea. In addition, I also like to go through and see what does the CCAP say that we need to focus on specifically, because obviously a lot of these science, and especially these science concepts and math concepts, are building on top of what other departments have done, and what other grades have done, actually, specifically. For example, I know weather is done in 2nd grade, and it used to be 3rd grade, but now we're repeating it in 5th grade, and then I know they do it again in 8th grade, I think. So we're repeating the process. Let's see, I am going to go through here and say now for myself, what resources do I have? Going in here, and I want to see here what are my end goals here. Is I need to find out, talking about how to measure temperature, how to collect data for temperature, what information can scientists use to gather information. So what tools can we use to gather temperatures, for example? Why does weather change from day to day? That is a great question. I love that essential question. So I'm actually going to take that and use that as a discussion. So let's put that in here. Letting it think, and pop that in there. I usually reformat these when I cut and paste them in, because I noticed that it has a little funny look. I think Jen Johnson taught us a little bit about this, how to reformat them. So, and then I give it a title. Okay, so that's another discussion I have up there for later in the week. And I'm actually going to drag that to the 4th day. I do rearrange the discussion boards to where they seem to be appropriately related to the lesson once I get the lessons in here. Going back to the CCAP, I dig from here. And like I said earlier, I usually look at the area of where we're in stage 3 to see what kind of resources they've given us. It says here unit plan sequencing. I like to look and see what they gave me here. And yes, I love it when this is actually where I pulled the idea of having 1 week about what the weather is. Here, I'm going to make this a little larger. Here. So you can see that one section is about what is weather, what is the temperature, the precipitation, humidity is what one we're doing right now. Next week we'll do air pressure related, and then the final week of the unit we'll actually talk about wind. These are the driving questions that are related to that. The science department wants us to focus on tools used to collect weather data, what information can scientists gather with tools, talking specifically about the water cycle, measuring temperature, wind, humidity, and precipitation. So how to measure it, what tools do we use, where does it come from, is really what we're looking at this week. So those are actually great driving questions right there for each day of the week. And actually, I am going to start out with the water cycle first and then work from there. So I will use the one from the water cycle as my day 1. And I will then put that in as what we will look at for day 1 and work from that. So once I have those essential questions identified and what we're going to be focusing on, the next thing I do is I open up my planning page, and I created this planning page kind of having taken this from another Schoology teacher from another part of the country. It's simple, but it's easy to use. It allows me to kind of gather information that allows me to then pop information into Schoology quickly. It's simple format for a week. So, and I think it was perfect for social studies and science. With our math, I do it a little differently because in math we have so many different parts or sections that are identified by math expressions. So it's a little different. For this week, as we said, we're going to be looking specifically at precipitation and humidity. And that is part of the weather unit. In here, I start to look for what kind of readings can I give the kids, or documentation can the kids read that are related to those topics? What kind of discussion questions can I create? What kind of activities can I give the kids? What kind of videos are suggested by the social studies or science department to use? And what other resources are out there that might be creative or fun to use related to this? So in here, in the readings, I'll get to that one in a second, kind of where I go for that. We've already just talked a little bit about the discussion questions or the guiding questions here, and those were really specifically from what we found in the CAP. I could take these right here and, for example, look specifically at the water cycle, going back to our documentation here. So our discussion is going to focus on the water cycle. I'm going to drag over so I can see those a little bit. It's going to talk about tools used to collect weather data. And then also information that scientists gather with tools. So information gathered. And then finally, the last part was how to measure temperatures. I am totally missed. So those are kind of our focus areas that we'll be looking at. And as I said, we'll pull discussion questions specifically from the CCAP for that. In the CCAP, they did talk specifically about some suggested videos. So I will actually show you where I see those at. In this CCAP, they have a list of suggested videos right here.